Montana Territory, 1884. Eleanor Hale had long ceased expecting the quiet comforts of a shared life. She no longer listened for the heavy thud of boots on the porch timber at twilight, nor did she anticipate another soul noticing the ache in her shoulders after a brutal harvest. At 52 years of age, she had spent 2 decades as Robert's wife before the harsh winter of '77 took him, leaving her alone for 7 solitary years. Sometime during that grueling expanse of time, Eleanor had settled into a stark reality she had not actively chosen but simply absorbed, much like the bitter autumn frost. She believed her life was fully written, the romantic chapters permanently sealed. The well-meaning folk of Willow Creek had unknowingly cemented this quiet resignation. Their cruelty was never intentional, just the casual bruising remarks that sink deeper than intended. Martha Greer would mention a younger widow finding a new match, subtly implying that youth was the only currency for such fortunes. The local reverend's wife would praise Eleanor's stoic capability, framing her fierce independence as a fortress that required no companionship. These tiny, thoughtless observations had woven themselves into Eleanor's very identity, until she stopped challenging their validity and accepted the solitude as her only destined companion. Then came a brisk Tuesday morning in late October. Eleanor was seated at her sturdy kitchen table, a ledger open before her, when the rhythmic crunch of approaching hooves disrupted the ambient silence of the valley. The sound slowed and halted right at her front gate. She opened the heavy wooden door to find Samuel Mercer occupying her porch. He stood there with a thick coil of fencing wire slung over his broad shoulder, his weathered hat respectfully clutched in his large hands. He wore the expression of a man who had rehearsed a practical excuse and hoped it would hold. He offered a polite morning greeting, noting mildly that a section of her eastern boundary fence had succumbed to the wind, and he had taken the liberty of bringing supplies. Eleanor looked at the heavy wire, then slowly shifted her gaze up to Samuel's face. She knew him the way anyone in a frontier settlement knows their neighbors. By name, tragic circumstance, and land boundaries. At 56, he had buried his own wife 4 years prior and managed his ranch 3 miles north with quiet, unwavering competence. "You brought wire," she stated, her voice perfectly steady in the crisp autumn chill. "I did," he replied, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Stepping back into the warmth of the cabin, she offered a rare invitation. "Coffee is on the stove. Come inside when you are finished." It was the unassuming dawn of something neither of these seasoned souls had charted, yet something both desperately required. Eleanor Hale possessed a profoundly respectable existence, a truth she acknowledged with the piercing clarity of a homesteader who had invested her own blood into the soil and could vividly account for every agonizing drop. Her vast 80-acre spread on the rugged eastern perimeter of Willow Creek was no mere hobby farm. It was a fully thriving enterprise. A crystalline stream cut purposefully through the sprawling southern pasture, breathing vibrant life into the verdant land, while the flourishing apple orchard Robert had diligently planted during their inaugural year yielded bountiful harvests. She single-handedly managed 30 head of resilient cattle, maintained an expansive kitchen garden that stubbornly produced vegetables straight through late September, and balanced the complex ledgers simply because she forced them to align. Robert had been a genuinely decent man and an irreplaceable partner. When pneumonia claimed him during the merciless blizzard of '77, Eleanor had surrendered completely to her grief for a season. Then, propelled by the relentless demands of the frontier, she ruthlessly locked her anguish away and returned to the grueling daily work that kept the property alive. However, what the capable widow deliberately refused to acknowledge was the lingering phantom of her former life, the hidden, vulnerable part of her spirit that occasionally still set out 2 porcelain teacups entirely by rote memory. The bruised part that had silently absorbed the stinging, thoughtless remarks from Martha Greer and the pastor's wife, ultimately allowing their grim verdicts to rewrite her own self-worth until she truly believed her vibrant years were forever finished. The perilous surrender had occurred so imperceptibly over the passing years that she had utterly failed to register the gradual transformation. She had not consciously observed the exact defining moment when mere survival became totally sufficient, nor had she registered the tragic day when sufficient gradually morphed into the absolute boundary of her existence. She was sitting quietly in her kitchen on a remarkably mundane Thursday evening in late September, reviewing her agricultural ledgers with the oil lamp turned up high to chase away the encroaching autumn darkness when the epiphany struck. It did not arrive with theatrical fanfare or shattering thunder, but rather manifested in the gentle, undeniable manner of a submerged truth finally floating to the surface. She softly closed the heavy, leather-bound ledger, lifting her tired eyes to the flickering golden flame of the glass lamp. The thought formed with crystal clarity. I have been flawlessly managing this solitary life for 7 agonizing years, and I am exceptionally proficient at it, yet it remains profoundly hollow, and I have been stubbornly pretending that it is enough. When Samuel Mercer rapped on her front gate the very next Tuesday holding his coiled wire, that heavy, unresolved revelation still echoed loudly in her mind as she boldly told him to come inside. Exactly 1 week later, the quiet rancher returned to her property with a substantial wagon load of freshly split firewood. It was decidedly not a trivial, neighborly token. It was a massive, full cord of seasoned timber, stacked with the meticulous precision of a man who fully intended for it to sustain her throughout the harshest winter months. Stepping out into the frosty morning air, Eleanor crossed the yard, folding her arms as she critically surveyed the towering pile of wood. She pointed out that it was an unnecessary surplus, stubbornly reminding him that she already possessed a woodpile to survive the impending freeze. Samuel simply countered that he had driven past her property the previous Tuesday, thoroughly inspecting her reserves, and determined she had barely half of what a brutal Montana winter demanded. She instantly offered to pay him for the timber and the strenuous labor, but he firmly refused, reminding her that the hot coffee she had provided previously was sufficient compensation. Eleanor opened her mouth to argue the ridiculous economics of his claim, but promptly closed it, overwhelmed by his quiet conviction. She politely thanked him, retreated into her kitchen, and stared blankly at her accounting books, desperately trying to convince her racing heart that this was merely frontier neighborliness. He materialized again the following week, inquiring politely if she required assistance repairing the sagging roof of her main barn before the heavy snows arrived, conveniently mentioning he had an idle hand available on Thursday. She desperately needed the help. The damaged roof had burdened her mental checklist since early September. The subsequent week, he arrived without any practical justification whatsoever. He simply tethered his horse at the gate on a quiet Thursday afternoon, claiming he was merely passing through the valley and wondered if she had a fresh pot of coffee brewing. She did. They sat at the rustic kitchen table for over an hour, exchanging intimate memories about Robert and his late wife Catherine, who had succumbed to illness 4 years prior. It marked the very first time Eleanor had spoken of her departed husband with someone who fundamentally understood the agonizing toll of such conversations and did not attempt to patronizingly diminish her enduring grief. When he finally tipped his hat and departed, she lingered on the shadowed porch, watching him ride steadily northward. At the Sunday church service that weekend, Martha Greer materialized at her elbow, noting aloud that Samuel Mercer had been visiting the Hale farm. It was not framed as a hostile accusation, merely an inescapable observation of fact. Eleanor coolly confirmed the visit, noting he had fixed a broken fence, supplied firewood, and shared a cup of coffee. Martha observed her with the piercing scrutiny of a woman who had known her for 3 decades, softly remarking that he was a thoroughly good man, subtly dismissing Eleanor's defensive claim that he was merely a helpful neighbor. After Martha retreated to her pew, Eleanor stared blindly at the wooden pulpit, her mind consumed by the image of a man who deliberately evaluated her dwindling woodpile to ensure her winter survival. She was fundamentally incapable of self-deception. Sitting alone in the crisp October twilight, she applied the same ruthless honesty to her personal affairs that she utilized for her ranching ledgers. Over the brief span of 3 weeks, Samuel Mercer had appeared on her property 5 distinct times. He had mended her perimeter, fortified her fuel reserves, dispatched labor for her failing roof, and ultimately arrived solely to converse across her scarred table. She possessed enough wisdom to interpret his actions. More profoundly, she recognized the sudden flutter in her chest whenever the distinct sound of his horse echoed down the dirt road. She had spent 2 full weeks actively pretending she was completely immune to this sudden awakening, stubbornly denying the undeniable reality of her own deeply buried desires. The tender feeling blossoming within her was undeniably authentic. She was 52 years of age, entirely alone for 7 taxing years, yet the approaching sound of Samuel Mercer's mount possessed the power to awaken a dormant longing she had strictly forbidden herself to entertain. However, following this honest internal accounting came the suffocating rush of town voices, the echoing whispers of Martha Greer, the condescending tones of the Reverend's wife, and a multitude of other casual judgments accumulated over her long widowhood crowded her anxious mind. They collectively insisted that she had aged out of this romantic narrative, dictating that fiercely capable solitary women required no such companionship and perpetually reinforcing the notion that romance was exclusively a younger woman's privilege. She fiercely wrestled with this suffocating societal decree for 3 agonizing days. On the 4th day, Samuel arrived with a heavy glass jar of golden honey harvested from his own thriving apiary. Finding her absent, occupied in the distant back pasture, he simply deposited the sweet gift on her porch railing and departed without creating a fuss, perfectly aligning with his humble, unassuming nature. Finding the luminous jar upon her return from the rugged pasture fundamentally shifted Eleanor's tightly held worldview, sparking a quiet rebellion. She stood frozen on the weathered porch boards, her calloused hands wrapping securely around the cool glass jar of honey, mesmerized as the expansive Montana Territory sky transitioned into a brilliant, fiery gold above the jagged mountain peaks. She reflected deeply on the sweet honey, the massive stack of winter firewood, and the steadfast man who had methodically counted her meager timber reserves on a random Tuesday morning to ensure her survival. A profound memory of her late mother surfaced, a piece of maternal wisdom offered when Eleanor was far too young to truly comprehend its weight, yet old enough now to recognize its devastating accuracy. Her mother had once warned that the most profoundly lonely souls on earth are not those who lack companionship, but rather those who are offered genuine love yet stubbornly refuse to acknowledge its presence. Carefully carrying the precious jar of honey inside the cabin, Eleanor placed it purposefully at the center of her kitchen table. She pulled out a wooden chair, sat down heavily, and for the first time in 7 exhausting years, she permitted herself the radical consideration that the well-intentioned townsfolk might be entirely wrong about her destiny. Emboldened by this staggering revelation, she made a definitive choice. She resolved to invite Samuel Mercer to her home for a formal supper in late November. The invitation was extended with deliberate intention, devoid of any manufactured practical excuses about broken fences or leaking roofs, which served as a powerful answer to the internal debates she had been waging. She prepared the meal with meticulous care, crafting a rich venison stew that Robert had always favored, a complex dish she had not possessed the emotional fortitude to cook for another living soul in 7 years. Samuel arrived precisely on time, stepping into the warm glow of her home. He paused to survey the carefully laid table adorned with her finest cloth, observing the bubbling stew and the obvious effort poured into the evening. He absorbed the scene with the profound understanding of a man who recognizes the magnitude of what he is being offered and refuses to insult the gesture by feigning ignorance. They dined and conversed with the same comfortable rhythm they had established over the preceding weeks, but an electric, unspoken tension hummed beneath their casual dialogue. Both acutely felt the shift, yet neither breached the delicate subject until the empty plates were cleared, fresh coffee was poured, and the freezing November darkness had fully enveloped the isolated homestead. Setting down her delicate porcelain cup on the table, Eleanor took a deep breath, locked eyes with him, and declared that she needed to speak her absolute truth. Samuel sat patiently, offering her the quiet grace to gather her courage. Eleanor stared intently at her own hands resting on the table, the scarred, weathered hands of a pioneer woman who had tirelessly worked this unforgiving soil for 3 decades. "I am perfectly aware of what your visits signify," she stated, her voice betraying a slight tremble she desperately tried to suppress. "I am not going to insult either of our intelligences by pretending otherwise." She lifted her gaze to meet his steady eyes. "And I know exactly what I feel in my chest when I hear your horse on the road." She held his unwavering stare, refusing to look away. "But everyone in this town says, they insist that I am simply too old for this nonsense. They tell me that this particular chapter of my life has permanently closed. I have been listening to their casual dismissals for so many years that I honestly believe I started to accept their grim verdicts as absolute truth." The warm kitchen plunged into a heavy, resonant silence, punctuated only by the crackle of the wood stove. Samuel did not hesitate. He reached across the checkered cloth and enveloped both of her trembling hands within his own. The large, heavily calloused hands of a man who had also spent 30 years wrestling with this harsh frontier. He looked at her with a fierce, uncompromising gentleness. "Eleanor, they are completely wrong." She searched his deeply lined face for any trace of pity, but found only steadfast sincerity. "I am 56 years old," Samuel continued, his voice a low, reassuring rumble in the quiet cabin. "I spent 4 agonizing years forcing myself to believe that exact same tragic story, telling my own heart that my romantic chapter was utterly finished and I was merely existing in the quiet epilogue that follows." His grip tightened marginally around her fingers. "I drove past your woodpile on a crisp Tuesday morning, meticulously counted exactly what resources you had left, and went back to my empty house. I simply could not stop agonizing over whether you would be freezing when February arrived." He locked eyes with her directly, refusing to let her hide from the absolute truth. That is decidedly not what a casual neighbor does. As she processed his earnest confession, he reiterated his verdict like a rancher reading a long fence line and reporting the undeniable facts. "They are wrong about us, and they are wrong about what we are still allowed to desire." Eleanor absorbed his words as the vast Montana Territory night blanketed the lands they both fiercely loved. "Samuel," she finally answered, "I must be brutally honest. My name remains on this land. I make my own decisions, and I will never surrender my hard-won independence." Samuel smiled warmly, acknowledging her fierce boundaries without hesitation. "I already know that, Eleanor. I am absolutely not asking you to change who you are." She turned her hands over within his grasp, returning the pressure. "Then let us bravely discover what this next chapter entails." By December, the perceptive township of Willow Creek inevitably noticed Samuel Mercer regularly taking his Saturday suppers at the Hale homestead. The reactions featured raised eyebrows and hushed whispers echoing across the general store aisles. However, Martha Greer approached Eleanor with refreshing candor, confessing she had spoken foolishly the previous year regarding youth and romance, directly admitting she had been entirely wrong. Eleanor accepted the apology with grace, neither minimizing the past hurt nor holding a petty grudge. Crucially, Eleanor did not alter her fiercely independent lifestyle. She continued to command her sprawling acreage, negotiating aggressive prices and directing her hands with unyielding authority. The profound difference was Samuel's steady presence. He worked alongside her, never attempting to manage her operations. One bitter January afternoon, she was battling a frozen iron gate hinge. After 20 freezing minutes, Samuel calmly took the heavy tool and smoothly worked the mechanism free. When she stubbornly noted she could have eventually fixed it, he simply replied that 10 minutes in January cold is 10 minutes in the cold, teaching her that accepting help did not diminish her profound strength. February arrived with the vicious, biting chill, specific to a Montana winter that outright refuses to surrender its icy grip. Eleanor had spent weeks deeply pondering the crucial difference between the resilient strength that gracefully endures and the toxic stubbornness that foolishly refuses all assistance. She had successfully run her massive property alone for 7 grueling years, initially out of sheer necessity, but eventually because she convinced herself that needing anyone equated to unforgivable weakness. She was violently disabused of this flawed notion on a frigid morning while struggling to string a heavy section of fresh Glidden barbed wire. It was definitively a 2-person task, yet she attempted it solo because her hired hand was ill and she stubbornly wanted it secured before the impending blizzard. Halfway across the icy yard, her heavy boot lost traction. She went down incredibly hard, her body slamming into the frozen earth. Sitting battered in the freezing mud, she took a grim inventory. Scraped palms, a deeply bruised knee, and a severely battered ego. She stubbornly hauled herself upright and finished the task, hiding the painful incident from Samuel. However, when he arrived that Sunday, he immediately noticed her distinct limp as she descended the wooden porch steps. He halted, instantly deducing the cause was the southern fence wire. He sat gently beside her, reminding her softly that asking for a hand is not the same as needing to be saved. Eleanor looked at the frozen ground, quietly admitting she was still actively learning that vital lesson. Samuel steadily confessed that he was still learning it too. They sat silently on the freezing wooden steps, the harsh February winds swirling around them, fully comfortable in their shared vulnerability. When the glorious thaw of April finally blanketed Willow Creek, It delivered the profound relief unique to a surviving frontier community. Together, they cooperatively reset the sagging southern fence post Samuel had first noted back in October, each anchoring a side, not out of practical necessity but simply because they desired the shared labor. Eleanor had spent the gentle spring evenings thoroughly examining her conscience regarding Robert's enduring memory. She ultimately concluded that a man who had loved her completely for 23 years would be entirely horrified if that beautiful love transformed into a suffocating fortress wall keeping her isolated. Over a quiet supper on the breezy porch, overlooking the magnificent Emerald Valley, she addressed Samuel directly. She clearly articulated that while she was incredibly proud of surviving alone, she desperately wanted to fully embrace this unexpected revival of her spirit, though she harbored lingering doubts about whether such profound happiness was permitted at her age. Samuel gently covered her calloused hand resting upon the wooden porch rail. He firmly stated he wanted to stop pretending their undeniable connection meant nothing, and formally asked her to marry him. They were wed in the humble Willow Creek Church on a radiant Saturday morning in late June, surrounded by the vibrant Montana summer and the soaring, sunlit mountain peaks. It was beautifully unpretentious. The very neighbors who had previously gossiped about her solitary age gathered to celebrate with quiet reverence, having entirely revised their misguided judgments. Martha Greer sat proudly in the very first row, having baked a magnificent berry pie for the reception, a tangible gesture of a woman making heartfelt amends through loving action rather than hollow apologies. Eleanor did not wear stark white. She donned an elegant cream dress, a rich hue representing something profoundly real, wonderfully lived in, and exquisitely beautiful, precisely because of its mature history, rather than despite it. Her silver-threaded dark hair was pinned up elegantly, framing a deeply lined face that proudly displayed 52 years of resilient frontier survival, without any deceptive pretense. When she gracefully walked down the narrow wooden aisle toward Samuel, he marveled at the fiercely guarded woman who had once cautiously told him to enter only when his chore was finished. They exchanged simple, honest vows. Afterward, as the cheering community enveloped them on the church steps, Eleanor enthusiastically returned Martha's warm embrace without her usual defensive armor, having finally learned the devastating emotional cost of maintaining that careful, suffocating pride. They deliberately chose not to merge their respective properties. Eleanor remained stubbornly resolute regarding this decision, and Samuel never offered a single argument because he fundamentally respected her reasoning before she even voiced it aloud. The 80-acre Hale homestead remained exclusively hers, representing her exhaustive labor, her hard-won legacy, and her intimate 30-year mastery of that specific soil. Samuel happily moved into her cabin because wherever Eleanor resided was exactly where he desperately wished to be. The subsequent years flowed with the gentle, rewarding rhythm characteristic of genuinely good seasons. Eleanor continued to command her sprawling ranch with the exact same precision and unyielding authority she had always wielded. Samuel worked steadily alongside her, never attempting to dominate or overshadow her efforts, and their combined extensive agricultural knowledge yielded astonishing prosperity neither could have achieved in complete isolation. In the booming season of '86, they celebrated their most lucrative cattle drive in either of their long histories. By '87, Eleanor meticulously grafted 2 new apple saplings from Robert's original heritage trees, while Samuel quietly constructed the protective wooden frames for them, a silent but profound testament to honoring the beautiful past while actively nurturing their vibrant, shared future. By '89, they joyously watched the brilliant flag rise in town as Montana achieved statehood. On a breathtakingly vivid evening in the autumn of 1891, exactly 7 years after Samuel had first materialized at her rusty gate, carrying a heavy coil of wire, they sat peacefully on the porch of the Hale property. The expansive Montana sky executed its spectacular October transition, shifting dramatically from brilliant gold to rich amber, and finally settling into the deep, bruised blue of the jagged mountains at twilight. Samuel casually nursed his steaming coffee, while Eleanor held a thick novel, though her eyes were entirely focused on the thriving, expansive orchard and the perfectly straight eastern fence line she had relentlessly built and maintained. Turning to her white-haired husband, she quietly confessed that she had almost refused to open her door that fateful morning he brought the fencing wire. Samuel chuckled softly, revealing a startling secret. He had nervously driven his horse past her boundary gate 3 separate times before finally gathering the courage to stop. Eleanor stared at him in sheer disbelief, entirely stunned by the revelation, before throwing her head back and releasing a magnificent, joyful laugh. The incredibly rare, genuine sound that brilliantly transformed her entire weathered face. She was 60 years old, blissfully seated beside the devoted man who had painstakingly counted her meager woodpile to ensure her survival, proving definitively that it is never too late to bravely open the gate to a beautiful new chapter.